Guest tonight, Ostvik Vikings, and I'm going to hand it over to you guys.
Okay, my name is Rich Mason. My wife and I are actually members of the Sons of Norway. We joined us the last year of the bar. And I'm the president / Jarl of our living history group, which is called Ostvik Vikings. Ostvik is actually Old Norse for East Village. So we kept it simple with that. My interest in Viking history came from my family's Norwegian heritage. And from the time I was a small child, my parents tell me about my father's side that came from Norway. And we're able to trace the family line back to like the 1590s in Norway. And most of our family came from a small village by the name of Tuna, T-U-N-E, in Kvinnesrad commune. And my great-great-grandfather immigrated to the United States in 1869. And his name was Peter Madsen. And we found him in the 1870 census, listed as Peter Madsen. In the 1880 census, he was listed as Peter Mason. So for some reason, he changed our last name. Our original family last name was Madsen. Now it's Mason, which is American. But anyway, so when I was a kid, I was interested in all things Viking. You know, Viking is a heritage thing. So with Ostvik Vikings, we picked the island of Berka, Sweden, because it was a trading center. And we picked the time frame of about 950 AD, which is towards the end of the Viking era. The Viking era was considered from 872 AD, that's Spartan? 893. 793 AD with the Viking raid of the monastery at Lindisfarne in England through the Battle of Hastings in 1056. So basically almost 300 years, that's what's considered to be the Viking era. And as I'm sure most of you know, Viking, the word Viking is actually a verb, it's not a noun. The Viking in Old Norse was to raid. So the Vikings, you know, they call themselves Norse. They were Norse from the north. But I don't know, the Anglo-Saxons or the French started referring to it as Viking because Viking was to raid. So if you were a raider or whatever, you were being a Viking. You were Viking. So the term Viking, I think, was used much later. It wasn't used by the Vikings themselves. Again, they called themselves Norse. The reason we picked Berka, Sweden, is because at that time it was a large trading center, and so there was a lot of different Norse Scandinavians that traded in that area. And my wife and I, we focused on a Norwegian Viking impression, which is a little bit different. I mean, there's just minor differences between it. Martin and his wife, now Martin was stationed in England for 5 years, and they reenacted with a Viking group in England. So their impression is more of a Anglo-Saxon Viking. Again, just minor differences in the costuming. And so we're kind of weird in that we like this dressing up as Vikings, but that's kind of part of how we learn the history of it. And my wife and Martin's wife, AnnaMarie, they focus a lot on the fiber arts, you know, and what it took to basically make the clothing. And like everything we're wearing here is as correct as we can get it from that era through the research we've been able to do. It's hard to do too much research because there's not a lot of surviving cloth artifacts, things like cloth, leather, wood that didn't really survive really well. Metal, on the other hand, there's an awful lot. They found an awful lot of swords, knives, axes, things like that. But it's a lot harder with the cloth in it. But as you can see for what we've set up on the table there, we focused on what it would take in a Viking village. Now, when you think of Vikings, you think of, okay, the raiders that went over to England. Okay, long ship, basically carrying military-age men. So, you know, those were the raiders, but the rest of the families stayed back in the Navy. You know, so they had to, and the raiding part was usually in the summertime. You know, because going across the North Sea in an open longboat, you couldn't do it in the winter at all. So it was basically kind of a summertime thing. Well, back in Scandinavia, they had, the families that were left behind, they had to basically do what was necessary to get what you needed to live through the winter. So the farming cycle they had there was much shorter in Scandinavia. That's one of the reasons that the Vikings loved England when they went to England, because much longer growing season, much more fertile. So that was why a lot of the Vikings actually settled in Great Britain at the end of the Viking Age, because it was so much better farming. It wasn't as, you know, unhospitable as Scandinavia would be, especially in the wintertime. But anyway, so we're kind of focused on what a Scandinavian village would be back in Scandinavia in the Viking era. So because, you know, we're a lot of older, we have families, that kind of thing. So we don't have as many military-aged men. If we were all military-aged men, it'd be kind of a small group. So, but anyway, so when we get done talking here, we've got everything set up so that you guys can go over. You can look at it. You can see we've got a table that has weapons, arms, and armor that they used. And then AnnaMarie has some of the things that were used for fishing, nets and whatnot. And then at the other end, my wife has a lot of things of how they would go about basically weaving the clothing of the head, because everything here had to be basically created from the ground up. And how long did it take to make a yard of fabric?
That number I can't tell you, but to be able to make a garment, you were talking about approximately 400 hours.
400 hours to make a single garment for the time you
Not
actually...
outfit.
Yeah, garment, single garment. By the time you basically sheared the sheep, they didn't shear the sheep, but they basically pulled the wool off it. By the time you get the wool off the sheep, to you're going through all the steps to basically weave it, then dye it, and then sew it into a garment. By the way, most of our clothing is all handmade. In fact, my wife makes most of it by hand. And we focus in our group, we try and make as much as we can by hand. I mean, all the shields we've made, all the garments are made by hand. We don't weave, because we haven't got quite to that point extent yet, but we're hoping down the road we'll be able to get there. Now, I was going to kind of turn it over to Martin, because he has some good slides. He actually teaches college level classes in medieval history. It's kind of a side hobby, I think. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Martin now.
Yeah, prepare for drinking from the fire hose, because I'm going to be giving you close to a semester course in Norse society and culture, and you're going to get it in somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. So this is definitely a crash course. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. There we go. Okay, first of all, for those of you who speak Norwegian or particularly Icelandic, I apologize when I butcher your pronunciation, because, come on, how many people here in the United States really know how to say liv Come on, folks, just call him that, man. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This one hit the end show. Right up there next, will be fine. Here we go. Okay, first of all, what question, like what Rich was talking about, what is a Viking? So I'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. Okay, people think Vikings equals this guy here. Not necessarily, because we actually don't know where the word comes from with certainty. It's not what the Norse coming out of Scandinavia called themselves. It's actually only used as a word a couple of times. Now the word vik can mean, the word vik can mean to go raiding as a verb, Viking, I'm going raiding. But it can also mean vik means fjord or bay in most Scandinavian languages. So it could also just mean the people of the bay. And one thing Scandinavia has plenty of is bays and fjords. So therefore, when you hear the word Viking, it's not what they were using. Usually they would have called themselves Danes, Yeats, Norse, there's lots of different things, the Northmen, stuff like that, all of which are words that eventually we see in our language today. So let's move on. So who were the Vikings? The Vikings were broadly a group of people from about the late 8th century, early 9th century, going until about the middle of the 11th century, who expanded out of what is Scandinavia, out of Norway, out of Sweden, and in particular out of Denmark, towards the east for the Swedes, for the Danes down south, and also towards England, the Norwegians towards Scotland, towards England, and eventually founding Iceland and creating settlements as far as Greenland, and then small settlements that existed in Finland in North America for a short period of time. Now, when we say the Viking Age lasted from around 800 to about the middle of the 11th century, it's not like the Vikings went away. I mean, I can look right over there, and I can see on the flag, and I can look on this gentleman's hat, and I can tell that the Norwegians are still around. They didn't pack up and leave. But what happened is that European societies, who were getting tired of getting beat on by the seafaring raiders, their societies got their act together enough and became powerful enough militarily that going out and trying to raid places as a living became a way of dying, not a way of living. So it wasn't that the Vikings went away, it's that the ability for them to go around and cause trouble went away. And also Scandinavia began getting more and more integrated into the affairs of Europe as Scandinavia Christianized through the 11th century. Let's go on the next slide. Like I said, I'm going through this really quickly. If you have any questions, please ask, or you can ask me here while we're talking over there too, either way. What made the Vikings able to do what the Vikings did? Simple, ships. But when you think Viking ship, the first thing that most people think of is the long ship with the warriors on the side going off to raid and plunder and cause trouble and stuff like that. That's what you're thinking of right there. This is a recreation of a Viking ship. This is being done, I believe, in Norway. But the other, and really the main ship that the Norse were using was a trading vessel, pardon me if I butcher the word here, called Knar. And this is a model of a Knar. A Knar, if you notice, it's got the same general pattern, but it's a little bit stouter, a little bit wider, a little bit higher in its board. That's because it's carrying up to about 24 tons of supplies on it. This is what you use when you're going trading. This is what you use if you're going to fight a war. And if you're going raiding, you might use either one of these. Because trading and raiding are synonymous for each other. If I pull up on a village and I see the village is defended, then I'm here as a trader. If I pull up and I see the village is not defended, then I'm here as a raider. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now, why is it pretty amazing that these people were able to create and have a trading network? They went all the way across the North Atlantic, all the way to Greenland and to North America. This is a map here that shows the average sea states around the world. And if you notice, the roughest waters in the entire planet are in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. The exact same routes that if you're going towards Iceland, or if you're heading towards Greenland, or if you're heading towards North America, the routes that you're going to be going through on the North Atlantic. Now we're going to find that if the YouTube video works, let's go for the next slide, and we'll hope. Try one more, and let's see what happens. Okay, if this had worked, that's okay. Okay, that's fine. If this had worked, what you would see, you can kind of see here. Here, this is a ship called the Harold Draken. It came to America about 10 years ago. So if you went and saw a long ship that came to America about 10 years ago, this is it. And the video would have shown this going through the seas, not going through a storm, just going through the seas in the North Sea going from Norway over towards, I believe, the Faroe Islands. You can kind of just get a picture here for what the sea states are like. And these are people who are going out in these vessels and heading out across 1,000 kilometers of open ocean. They're pretty brave people. And something that is telling is that in one of the sagas, in the saga of the Greenlanders, which tells about going to the settlement of Greenland, the initial group that set out from Iceland to Greenland had, I believe it was 40 ships, 20 ships made it. And this is spoken matter-of-factly. It's not spoken as in there was a terrible tragedy and we lost half the ships. This is how many ships left. This is how many ships made it. This was a dangerous profession. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
You know, if they were rowing and sailing, they had to be
Okay, I'll take
really
these
strong.
other way. They'd be sailing as much as they could, but they had the ability to row. And one of the other things that were great about these vessels was that they did not draw much water. So you could take them up the rivers. And that's one of the things that made it able so that they were able to go and ravage Paris at one point. That was not replicated in the recent Olympic opening ceremony, unfortunately. And other river systems. It's also how they were able to build a trading network that went all the way from modern-day Sweden all the way down to Baghdad, but particularly down to Constantinople, going on the great rivers of now Eastern Europe and Russia. Okay, Viking Age Norse society. Just quick on this. At the bottom of society, you have the thralls, slaves. In any early medieval society, that's who you have at the bottom of the society pyramid. They can be slave from birth, they can be slave through purchase, they can be slave through conquest, or they can often be a slave because I am starving to death, and my family is starving to death. You are a rich jarl, so I will come and I will bend the knee to you and willingly become your slave, because now you have to feed me and clothe me. And when the alternative is starvation, many people took that alternative. We see the same thing in Anglo-Saxon society also. Above the thralls, the first level of freemen were called bondi. Now, you may have seen this pyramid and seen these terms in other formats, because there's lots of different terminologies that are used. These are the ones that I could find that come to close for Norwegian society, because the course that I'm getting ready to teach is on actually Iceland and Greenland. Don't tell the Icelandic society here, but they're Norwegians who just moved. Still love them though. So once you're a bondi, you're a free man. Then you have multiple interlocking layers of society, but then you have the Hufr. Those are mid-status individuals. They've got some land, they've got some wealth, but they're not wealthy. Not tremendously wealthy. Tremendously wealthy, your high aristocracy, that's the Jarls. And the Jarls, in many cases in this period for Norway, Sweden, Denmark, your difference between a Jarl and a king, there almost isn't a difference. I'm the Jarl, but you're the king, but I actually have more power, so you do what I tell you to do, not the other way around. I'll make fealty to you, but at the end of the day, you know who's boss. Now, when you get to Iceland, these all disappear. Iceland has never had a king, despite what the Norwegians will tell you. It's never had a king of Iceland. It's had to pay fealty to places, but it never had a king, because it didn't need one. It didn't need these levels of society. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit here about the role of women in Norse society, because you always hear about big burly Vikings going off to slaughter, and you hear about shield maidens going off to fight furiously and stuff like that. Women had incredibly important roles to play in society, and they often don't get recognized the way that they should, and recognized for the contributions that they were making, not what Hollywood wants them to make. So Norse women had multiple roles. First of all, they had critical economic production roles. Who's turning the milk into skyr? Skyr is a form of yogurt that was used by the Icelanders. I don't know if the Norwegians used it or not. It's the women who are doing that. In Icelandic society, in AnnaMarie, did the Norwegians do Rockmall also, or was that just the Icelanders? Okay, but in Icelandic society, they actually used cloth woven by women as currency. That's how you made money. Guess what? She makes the money. You don't. That's coming a few hundred years in the future. Wives and mothers. In a society where child mortality is over 50%, the role of wife and the role of mother is incredibly important. And I could go into great detail of this. I'm condensing into one slide a half-hour presentation that AnnaMarie does. Women also function as concubines. Don't think of concubine here in the way that you would think of concubine in the modern setting. There was an Icelandic saying, it's better to be a good man's concubine than a bad man's wife. Because it was expected that males would go off and would have partners beyond their wives, where they would have bonds of affection with those people. And usually they would recognize the children, and sometimes they would love those children, sometimes more than their own children, their own biological children with their wives. So it's an important function in the society, and it's not considered adultery. Adultery is when a man sleeps with a married woman. That's adultery. Anything else is fair game. Now, what's good for the gander is not good for the goose. It does not work the other way around. If the wife sleeps with anybody besides the husband, it's adultery, and the penalties could be extremely strict. Now,
actual marriages?
I'm sorry.
Was there real marriages at that point?
I'm sorry. If there's real.
Did they have marriages? Were there weddings and?
Oh yeah, there were wedding ceremonies. We have them talked about in the sagas, and then eventually, when the church gets involved, the church talks about wedding ceremonies. Again, I'm condensing it in order to save time because I'm already over time. I'm having to leave out so much stuff that would be in. But sometime come take the class that we're teaching at LuAnn sometime, and you'll learn all about this. And also at some point, if you all would ever want to have us back and talk in greater detail on any of these topics, I'm always happy to talk about early medieval history. Okay, it's still a patriarchal society. It's still, at the end of the day, the final decisions are made by men. Women did have rights and obligations. Their rights and obligations are different than those for men. They're usually entrusted with the day-to-day management of the household. The husband's off herding the cattle up in the mountains. The husband is off trading. The husband is off raiding, whatever. Somebody's got to run the household. And if you're the wife of a Jarl, that's a pretty complex household that you're running. Women have the right to own and to inherit property, including land and livestock. And land and livestock's where the money is. Silver's nice, but you can't beat a good cow. Women also had divorce rights in these societies. And again, I could go into greater detail on that only in the interest of time. I'm leaving that stuff out. Next slide, please. Okay. First of all, I want to point out, whenever I would participate in the mock battles when I lived in England, that's me. That's usually how you end up at the end of the battle. Laying there on the ground with my shield over my head and curled up in fetal position and hoping nobody lands on me. But, okay, quick quiz. If the battle goes bad for you and you end up like me right there and these women show up, where are you going to go? Only if you're Christian. But okay, where are you gonna go? What's the place called? Okay. Next slide, please. You're halfway right. This is surprising to a lot of people. Not only does Odin have a hall, Freya has a hall, Odin's wife. Or she has a place that you go if you are one of the slain on the battlefield. And the Valkyries come and they take you away to a place called Folkvanger. And being carried away to Folkvanger is no dishonor. And in fact, Freya gets the first pick of the warriors who were slain on the battlefield, not Odin. Freya does. The only difference that we've been able to, that in our research that we've been able to find between Valhalla and Folkvanger is Valhalla is a hall, Folkvanger is a field, and you also and also Freya gets the first pick. So, next slide, please. Now, as we get close to closing, one thing to remember is you always think of Vikings and battle. This is a fighting society. It is not a military society. And by that, what I mean is that if you are a male, you better know how to fight and to kill if necessary. But it's not your job. Professional armies are just beginning to be in their infancy in most of Europe, and definitely does not typify Scandinavia. A raiding party is not an army that is disciplined, under control, divided up the way that armies are, and taken off to do what armies do. So therefore, it's a fighting society. It's not a military society. But violence, of course, is always an option. Next slide, please. Okay, that is a real quick overview. I'm sorry that I actually ran about 5 minutes longer than I meant to, but I wanted to go as quickly as I could so that we can have time for the really cool stuff, which is for you to come over and look and see. Please feel free to handle anything that is here. Everything is for display. Everything is for touch. And please feel free to ask questions. And lastly, just in case you're wondering where we get all of our stuff, yes, we make all of our stuff, and sometimes we buy it. My cloak is a rug. It's a rug that English Heritage sells in the gift shop at Clifford's Tower in York. We're very inventive at making things people need to see. So thank you for listening to me go on for 20 minutes here. Here, please come over and absolutely take pictures of anything. We're hands.
Thank you.